what? The children of Israel, or Pharaoh refers to them in Exodus chapter 9, verse 7 as the Israelites. So we see the Hebrews, the Israelites, and now here in Esther, Jews. And they will be called Jews from that point forward. Some also call them Hebrews, but Jews. Now, Mordecai, a certain Jew, he had a standing in the society. He worked at the gate, if you would. And he was a Benjamite. Who else do we know of, a very big character in the New Testament that was a Benjamite, that came from the tribe of Benjamin? Absolutely. Paul, Saul of Tarsus, a Hebrew of Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin. So was Mordecai. Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin. It's interesting to note that Mordecai, his ancestors, were some of the folks that were carried away into Babylonian captivity when Nebuchadnezzar assaulted Judah, okay? And Xerxes had become king now. 486 to 465 was his reign, but he became king some over 100 years after the fall of Judah, Jerusalem. So Mordecai was a descendant of one of the families, if you would, of the tribe of Benjamin, of Kish, the Bible describes to us, because Jehoiachin was the king at the time of that capture by Nebuchadnezzar, when they captured the tribe of Benjamin. So over 100 years had passed. A descendant now of those folks from the tribe of Benjamin, Mordecai, is a worker at the gate. You know, we could spend a lot of time, at least 1 or 2 class sessions, on what it meant to be a worker of the gate in the Old Testament. And we can see it in the New Testament. The wise men. And you know what? There's one term, I found this interesting. There's one term for leaders. These men were leaders. They would help judge domestic disputes and determine whether or not an individual had a right to go see the king, and then they would allow that individual, through the process of sending the courier to the king's chamberlain, to say, so-and-so wants to meet with you, there's a serious problem. They were the ones that sat at the gate that determined who would have access to that type of judicial system back then. Same thing occurred under Mosaic law, even in the New Testament. But there's one term that is used in the Old and New Testament that describes these men, that Mordecai had this position. Does anyone recall what that is? It comes over into the New Testament Christianity form of worship in life. Elder. The elders that sit at the gate. Interesting. I found that interesting. So, Mordecai was one of these men that was his job. He was an attendant at the gate. We can read a lot into what Mordecai, his life was about. Because Hadassah, her parents had died somewhere along the way. Perhaps they had died after they had settled in captivity. The Bible doesn't say. But his cousin, Hadassah, died. His dad's brother, his paternal cousin, had died. Well, her parents had died. So, what he could have done, well, I've got enough problems as it is myself. I mean, we're here living in the captivity with these Persians. These people are mad. They're crazy. I don't have time to deal with that. No. What did Mordecai do? Mordecai said, yes, I'll step up. I will help this young girl. I'll make her part of my family. And as we recalled a few weeks ago, back in those years, back in those days, and even some of that culture falls over in today's society in that part of the country, women were treated very, very badly. an orphan girl most likely would have ended up in slavery or prostitution if someone had not taken that orphan girl in. They had no chance. Speaks a lot about Mordecai. So we're introduced to Hadassah. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. For she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. It's interesting that now Hadassah, the Hebrew name that she was given, has been changed to Esther. We mentioned this a few weeks ago. Wonder why? We don't know. But we do, reflecting back on Daniel chapter 1, verse 7, when those other young men, they were teenagers at the time, were taken into Babylonian captivity years prior to this setting. In verse 7 of Daniel chapter 1, the chief eunuch to Nebuchadnezzar gave these Hebrews these names. To Daniel, he named Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So it seems to me that to bring these young people into society of being in slavery in a foreign country, their names were changed. In Daniel's situation and his three friends, the Bible describes those individuals as being very smart, very good-looking, handsome young boys. Here in this setting with Hadassah, the Bible describes her as young, lovely, and beautiful. And her name was changed. Some commentators like to reflect upon this name change because Hadassah means myrtle. Her Persian name, Esther, means star. She's referred to as the star of Persia in a lot of settings. Some scholars like to equate that as a prophecy that was found or is found in Isaiah chapter 55, where symbolism there of a myrtle replacing the briars and the thorns of the desert. That Esther, through the hand of God, is going to change the course of an entire race. Interesting. Chapter 2, verse 7. She's taken to Shushan, the citadel. Look in chapter 2, verse 8. That Esther was taken to the king's palace. When these, if you would, soldiers, governors, officials, not Marine recruiting stations, you didn't get to walk up and decide voluntarily if you wanted to go to Shushan and become part of the harem. The Bible tells us that she was taken. Can you picture it one day at Mordecai's house? That all of a sudden the soldiers arrive? She's taken. She had no choice in the matter. These young women were taken all across the province. Herodotus and other historians tell us that there may have been 1,500 or more young women initially taken. Some historians say 400, up to 1,500, but we don't know. But we do know that there was a time period that lapsed once they were taken and then selected, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But the Bible tells us that after she was taken, that Esther found favor. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 3 through 4 tells us that if we are lovely inside, and the Bible indicates and implies that Esther, not only her beauty was outwardly, but her beauty was inwardly too. The Bible says in Proverbs 3, verses 3 and 4, let not mercy and truth forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. and so find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and man. That applies to us today. Loving graciousness, humility, getting along with people. God says that we'll have high esteem in His sight and in the sight of our fellow man. Proverbs chapter 3, 3-4. And this describes Esther. And then moving on, class is moving quickly. In verses 10 and 11, we see that Mordecai had told her not to reveal her background. Perhaps this was the reason her name was changed. I do not know. But she is now Esther. Her guardian, Mordecai, tells her and instructs her, do not reveal your identity. The hand of God and the glove of time. What if she had revealed her identity as not being a Persian or being a Jew? Don't know. But it's interesting to note that she was so lovely, she was so beautiful. She wasn't obnoxious. You ever know someone that seems they have a lot going for them, but they're obnoxious? Their nose is kind of pointed upward, if you would. This is not the case with Esther. She was beautiful both inside and outside. Because what does she do? She says, yes, I'll follow your instructions. God tells us in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, the way of a fool is right in his own or her own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. Wise. And then we see in verse 11 that Mordecai, what did he do every day? Now that she's inside the harem, he's a worker at the gate. Was he concerned about her? Absolutely he was. Parents, have any of y'all paced at home before? In verse 11, and every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Until you have children, you can't really describe the feeling. I was told that before I ever got married, before we ever had children. But now, after years into it, I'm sure everyone would agree with me, your outlook changes a whole lot, doesn't it? Once you have a child. How many pacing hours have you had? How many minutes have you spent wondering what they're doing, wondering how they are, where they're at, what's happening in their lives? Because you're blocked out. Sometimes by miles, thousands of miles, sometimes for other circumstances. But Mordecai, this again speaks to his disposition and the type of character he had. He was pacing, wondering about her, what was going on. What a beautiful figure of Mordecai. So, we handed out something. I thought it would be, I had this idea to hand it out. I don't know if everyone got one in every family. But I had never smelled myrrh before. Did everyone get one? Who didn't get one? You have any more? If you haven't got one, raise your hand. But it's interesting in verses 12 through 14 that once these women were assembled, ladies, it wasn't a day spa. It wasn't a week spa. It wasn't a month spa. It was a year-long beauty spa. Could you imagine? 6 months, the Bible tells us, of oil of myrrh. So I said, I don't know what myrrh smells like. So I got on Amazon. Next day, I have myrrh. Take that home with you. It's incense. Burn it. In fact, some historians tell us that that's what they burned in religious ceremonies as well. But for 6 months, myrrh was used on these young ladies. So I spent a lot of time reading about why would they use myrrh and what is myrrh. Well, myrrh basically comes from the myrrh tree. It's the sap that comes out of the bark. The sap's collected. The sap is then processed. How did they process it? They used some type of oil in a big stone in the sun. What type of oil? It could have been almond oil, coconut oil, olive oil, and then they would take the myrrh sap, put it into the oil, and let the sun heat it up, and it would infuse into the oil, and that became myrrh. It was traded. It was highly valuable. And some of the things that I read when the wise men came to see Jesus as an infant, they brought what gifts? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Myrrh was considered in most quarters at that time more valuable than gold. Myrrh. Why? There's a lot of stuff on the internet for you guys, for everyone, of us to read. I've read a little of it. Myrrh was used for medicinal purposes and for beauty purposes. Ladies, I don't know if you do a mask in the morning. I've seen that occasionally at my house. They would use a mask of myrrh. Not only would it be on the face, it would be an entire all full body mask. You ever heard of a mud bath before? This was a myrrh bath. Why would you do that? Because myrrh, I didn't realize this, but after doing a little study on it, but myrrh actually has this type of characteristic that fights off bad bacteria. It exfoliates your skin. It takes any of the blemishes that we may have on our face or other parts of our body, and over a period of time, myrrh will remove those. Interesting. So, for 12 months, these ladies were going through this type of beauty spa, and for 6 months of it, oil of myrrh, the most expensive ointment of the day. And then an additional 6 months was spent on perfumes and makeup. Believe it or not, way back, you've seen some of the paintings and artifacts from ancient Egypt, even before this time frame, and in ancient Persia of this time frame, where folks were dressed up elaborately. Women wore makeup, women wore perfume, women went to beauty spas, and if you were part of the king's harem, you had the very special of all specials. You could do it for 12 months. So when you came out, historians say that when a woman would walk into a room of this setting, or maybe that big palace that he had, that big banquet room that would hold 10 to 15,000, you could smell that lady coming in on the other side of the room. Wow, here she comes. But myrrh was also used as medicine. It would treat canker sores. It would treat cold sores. It would treat all sorts of things that people dealt with back then. And it's still used in some products today. So I thought that was interesting. So Merry Christmas. Everyone has myrrh. But 6 months passed, and during this 6 months, the next 6 months, according to ancient Persian customs, during this beauty spa, in preparation to be in the selection, beauty pageant, if you would, for King Xerxes, that these young ladies would go through perfume baths daily, plucking of eyebrows. It was common for them to have their hands and body parts painted with henna, as was the custom. But the question I had in reading this initially was, well, why did it take 12 months? And some commentators say that there were several reasons why it took 12 months. One reason was to make sure that none of these young ladies had any type of disease that would be communicable to King Xerxes. And believe it or not, myrrh is used to treat some type of transmitted diseases. Interesting. Also, in case one of the young ladies may have been pregnant, 12 months had passed and that would be identified and she would be kicked out of the harem. And it would not go to Xerxes or the king's charge. It's very interesting when you start studying what was going on back then. So, Queen Esther, in her wisdom, she obtained more favor than anyone in the harem, the Bible describes to us. And as part of that, Queen Esther was part of God's plan. The hand of God in the glove of time, working behind the scenes. But Esther was part of his plan. You know, in Matthew chapter 5, let's look at this real briefly. Class is almost over. I can't believe it. But in Matthew chapter 5, many of us think, well, that was Esther. I'll never be that way. I'll never be like she was. But Jesus is challenging each and every one of us that we can even be better than Esther. Think about it. You are the salt of what? The world. You are the what? The light. A city that's set on a hill that cannot be overlooked. Each and every one of us, if we render obedience to God's plan, if we become one of his children, not an Israelite, not a Hebrew, not a Jew, but a Christian in our time frame, if we become a Christian, God has a plan for us. He will lift us up. When we read the Bible and we see where Jesus is now introducing in this formal, as we talked about it one quarter this year, of the Sermon on the Mount, he describes each and every one of us as being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. That's exactly what Esther was in her little portion of the world back in Persia. We can be that here in 2023. We really can. How can we do that? This is the verse I wanted us to remember in verse 15. That they may see your good works. How can we do that in 2024? How can we let our light shine? How can we be the salt of the earth? By doing what? Good works. That's what Christianity is all about. That's one of the lessons out of chapter 2. Time is almost up. We understand the last few verses of chapter 2 that Mordecai, while sitting at the gate, he overhears Bigtha and Teresh planning to execute Xerxes. He relays that message, and guess what Xerxes does? The Bible says that they were hung on the gallows, but in the ancient form of Persian execution, when someone attempted assassination upon the king, and in the original Hebrew word, gallows really means tree. And some scholars tell us that that wasn't a hangman's noose. That what actually happened to these two individuals was, and what the Persians, they were really, we could spend a lot of time on all the different types of punishment they had. It's unbelievable, some of the things they did. But in this situation, a lot of Bible scholars believe that they were impaled. They would take a tree and hone down a large pole they would insert that into the groin area of an individual and impale them, and they would hang there and suffer a terrible, terrible death for all to see. And they would hang there until their carcass was finished, decayed, or eaten, whatever. Anyway, that's chapter 2. Any questions or comments? I know the class is over with. We got 10 seconds. Yes, ma'am. The Far East, they did that a lot too. China, they and other places did that too. It's terrible. Thank you for your attention. Next week, Lord willing, we'll be out of town and there'll be a substitute for chapter 3. Thank you.